right, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for having me here. I don't get down to this area too often. I told a couple people I'm based out of Orlando. My name is Ed Harris, and I'm with the FWC Invasive Plant Management section. Have been in that position since 1993, so have been out on those lakes for a bit, worked with a lot of different people within the agency and locally as well. You know, a lot of people are still there, a bunch of people have come and gone. So I brought some materials. Most of y'all got here before I did, but it's sitting up here on the table if somebody wants to come and get some. So the first is this is a vegetation map, you know, what we are referring to as the heat maps. This was the submersed vegetation survey that was done in June. And the maps show, you know, if it's not blue, then there is vegetation there. The warmer the color, the more dense the vegetation. So the areas that are orange and red are just solid vegetation. Now these maps don't give an indication as to how tall these plants are in the water column, but it just gives us an overall coverage. If it's hydrilla, we know that you know, throughout the summer that it's going to get closer up to the surface. Water comes up, hydrilla will come up with it, water goes down, hydrilla stays there. So everybody can take a look at that. The second, these are a couple pages that I printed out. This was the approved management plan for the Kissimmee Channel Lakes. And I don't know how many of y'all were involved in the meetings that we had. It was a couple of years ago. The first meetings we did virtually because we were still coming out of COVID restrictions. But we had meetings in a number of different places and came up with guidelines for resource management to meet certain goals. So this is a printout that basically discusses hydrilla management in general and hydrilla management, vegetation management on Toho specifically. So as we talk about some of this stuff, if you haven't seen this before, this is a good thumbnail sketch. But if you want the full 130-page report, then I can email that to you or show you where to download it yourself. A lot of good information in there, a lot of you know, information in there, but you can pick through and search and find some good stuff. So before I talk about this one, which is some very preliminary draft, even more preliminary information, what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about Lake Toho specifically. What's been going on out there, what has not been going on out there, where we are in the planning process, the budgeting process, and then give everybody here a chance to answer, you know, whatever questions you have. And I'm sure you've got one or two questions. So something that already came up tonight is, why does Lake Toho have so much hydrilla in it right now? Two reasons. One is the lake is just incredibly rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. It's been coming in through stormwater, treated wastewater runoff, just everything coming in there since the 1980s. So that lake has been heavily fertilized, and just like you fertilize a crop, you fertilize your lawn, you're going to get a response from the plants. And the hydrilla is just going gangbusters out there because of those high nutrient levels. The Department of Environmental Protection has stated that Lake Toho has a biological impairment because of the high nutrient levels. And we have looked at ways to remediate that, but outside of spending several $1 billion to get that cleaned up, it's more going to be moving forward, how can we keep it from getting worse? Not so much, how can we come in here and clean it up? It's not to Lake Apopka nutrient levels, but it's still pretty significant. The second reason there's a lot of hydrilla out there is that we haven't done any hydrilla management for almost 4 years. When there was a large concern throughout the state about herbicide applications that were being made in state waters. And it led to our management at the time saying, all right, we're going to put the brakes on for several months until we get more information. We had a series of meetings around the state. We had people come in from a number of universities, present information, we answered a lot of questions. And overall, what we heard from people specifically about the Kissimmee chain was stop managing hydrilla. Lake Toho was about 30–35% hydrilla at that time, and everybody said, looks great, don't manage hydrilla on Lake Toho. And as our budget got cut every year by the legislature and the agency had to allocate the funding, they looked at the statewide resources and said, well, nobody wants us to manage the Kissimmee chain, let's go put it on Panosofsky, Lake Tarpon, Lake Seminole, Orange Lake, all these other systems where people wanted management. So the budget for Toho dwindled down to basically what we could do to maintain some boat ramps and a couple of trails. And hydrilla has gone from 30% coverage in the lake now to 75, almost 80% coverage in the lake. It's not all at the surface. There are a lot of places you can run through. You'd never know there was hydrilla there unless you're paying attention to your fathometer, and you can see it, 4 feet below the surface, 100% coverage down there on the bottom. So that's what this map shows. And I don't know, who's been to Lake Toho like in the last month? So if you look at the south end of the lake, it is almost 100% vegetation cover down there. Now, some of these areas up around, if you're familiar with that, the Browns Point area, just south and west of Browns Point, there's a lot of pepper grass in there, or what we call Illinois pondweed, which is a native plant and has really started growing like gangbusters in just thousands of lakes in Central and South Florida. It is coming on everywhere. And we're not sure why. We think it's a combination of bottom sediment is just right, water temperature is just right, overall temperature, amount of sunlight, nutrients in the water. There's something that just flipped the switch for that plant, and it is coming on like crazy. And then within the shorelines, up in the grass lines, we've got a lot of eelgrass, more pondweed, Kissimmee grass, bulrushes, bladderworts, a real variety of stuff in there, along, mixed in with hydrilla. So the legislature this year heard from a lot of people saying we need hydrilla management on Lake Toho. And they allocated almost $4 million for hydrilla management, and as they stated, hydrilla management in Central Florida lakes. And people within our agency said, well, Lake Toho is going to be the priority. We haven't managed hydrilla in Lake Toho for 4 years, so we want to set that up as priority number 1. Now, that's not to say we're going to go out there and do $4 million worth of hydrilla treatment in Lake Toho. What that means is we now have the opportunity to come out and manage hydrilla in areas of the lake that we haven't for the last couple of years, but we need to do it thoughtfully. The agency also, who's familiar with the compact that was recently signed where the Seminole Indian tribes and I think the Miccosukes were given the right to do expanded gambling, and the state got a ton of money to make that happen. So right now we are looking at a budget of almost $20 million for large-scale habitat management and rehabilitation projects. And our agency wants to focus that on the Kissimmee chain of lakes. They're looking at Lake Toho, Lake Cypress, and potentially Lake Jackson. So we can tie all these things together. So what we're going to be looking for are areas where it's feasible to manage hydrilla and tie it into these larger habitat projects. And that might be managing hydrilla, replanting with eelgrass. It could be taking out some of these big stands of the invasive water primrose and replanting with bulrush and Kissimmee grass. We are just now getting direction about how to put those plans together. They probably won't be implemented until March, April, but we've been told to look at the big picture. The last thing related to hydrilla management is, I guess, clarification, new direction that we've gotten from the US EPA that directs us to, again, be very thoughtful in how we are applying herbicides. That cutting a trail through the same area again and again and again, putting herbicide out there every year or twice a year to keep this one area open that would grow back if you left it alone is not economically or environmentally feasible according to the EPA. So what we are looking at is a project like we did on Lake Cypress. When we looked at Lake Cypress, we had submersed vegetation out there other than hydrilla. It covered about 15, 18% of the lake, and that was mostly peppergrass and eelgrass. And it was agreed to by our fisheries biologist. And let me take a step back. I'm not a fisheries biologist. You know, I've got a degree in general biology, but I work with a lot of fisheries biologists, so some of it's rubbed off on me, but I'm not a fisheries biologist. So we got everybody to agree that if we take all the hydrilla out of Lake Cypress and agree to keep it out for 5 years, we will get significant expansion of these native submersed plants. Sometimes in the meetings or the papers, we call those SAV, submersed aquatic vegetation. So if you ever hear anybody talking about SAV, we were talking about plants underneath the water. So we expect that we will get expansion of that native SAV, and if not, we are going to come back in and we are going to replant eelgrass. We don't think we need to plant peppergrass. And we've got a lot of eelgrass out there down in the southwest corner of the lake, if you guys have been to Lake Cypress recently. So again, we're looking at these big picture projects. And it's not just coming out and we're going to pour $3 million worth of work into Lake Toho, then walk away until next fall, then come back and put $3 more million into it. That is just not sustainable. And what we have heard from the public for a number of years is, you know, the work needs to be thoughtful and sustainable. That's what we're getting internally, and that's what we're getting from the US EPA. So the third drawing that I've got here, it's got a bunch of shapes on it drawn in green and orange. And what I want to talk about first are the ones that are drawn in green. These are areas that within our agency we have said this is where it makes the most sense to think about tier 1 and tier 2 priorities of hydrilla management. And that's what we are going to see what we can work up a budget for, and to come out and see, you know, what the public is generally going to support. Now I'll say to start with, if everybody tells us you got to do this and this, and the agency biologists say, you know, that's just not feasible, it doesn't meet these other criteria, we're probably not going to do that. Now that doesn't mean that we didn't listen to you. It just means that we listened to you, we got a lot of information, and we made a different decision than the one you wanted us to make. But I don't want anybody to ever say that we're not listening. Just keep in mind that we're not always going to do what you told us to do. Anybody who's got a teenager, okay, you kind of know how that goes.
Maybe I wasn't listening. Which represents tier 1 and what's tier 2?
The green is tier 1.
Okay.
Maybe some of that's going to be tier 1.5. The orange is tier 2.
Okay.
So two of the areas that we are definitely going to manage hydrilla in are the north end of the lake, which is about 700 acres of hydrilla. There's a lot of lily pads up there, American lotus, spatterdock, fragrant water lily, a lot of Kissimmee grass, some bulrush, and we get snail kites that nest up in there. And if I haven't mentioned snail kites, I don't think I have, a federally endangered bird, and everything that we do to manage any resource on the Kissimmee chain of lakes, at a minimum, cannot have a negative impact on snail kite reproduction, success, and we try to gear projects to enhance snail kite habitat so that, you know, they can continue to build their numbers. 8 years ago, Lake Toho was the kite nesting capital of the state. They've started to shift back down to their more, you know, historic areas around Okeechobee and the Everglades, but we still get a fair number of them on Toho, East Toho, Kissimmee, and every once in a while they'll show up on Hatchnaha. Haven't seen them on Cypress. Every once in a while we'll see a couple on Lake Jackson. Paynes Prairie, they're all over the place, scattered, but right now mostly in Okeechobee. So this north end of the lake, I can say with almost certainty, hydrilla is going to be taken out of that area. Public navigation coming out of the main city ramp, people just cannot get out of there. And if we can get the hydrilla out of there, along with harvesting some of that real dense water primrose. And I don't really know how to describe the water primrose. I'm sure you've seen it out there. Basically, it's a yellow flowering bush that gets about this tall, and it makes a big floating mat. It's got roots that are about 20 feet long, and it chokes out everything. It takes out the bulrushes, the Kissimmee grass, the maiden cane, the pads. I mean, everything just gets smothered under this. And it's a plant that really is not feasible to control with herbicides, and we don't really try to control it with herbicides, unless it's a new infestation where we think we can keep it from spreading. But the bigger plots out there, they really do need to be mechanically harvested. And that's going to be some of these big ticket projects that we're looking at for next spring. Harvesting those plants, or harvesting any plant, usually runs about $5,000 an acre to get that stuff out of there. And the biggest part of that cost is the transport. It's fairly easy to go out there and cut it loose, but now you've got to put it on a barge and take it to shore and put it in a dump truck and drive it 5 miles and dump it someplace. So the personnel and the equipment that's involved are what bring those costs up. The second area where we are more likely to manage hydrilla completely is going to be down in Goblet's Cove. That we need to have some kind of an opening in there, and the trails that we cut last for a couple of months, no matter what herbicide we use. And there are a variety of herbicides that are available for hydrilla management. And we try not to use the same one over and over and over again. Anybody who was around when DEP had this program back in the 90s may remember the use of a herbicide called Sonar. Sonar was the silver bullet for killing hydrilla. And what we didn't know, because we had never seen anything like this before, was we actually selected for plants that had a natural tolerance to that herbicide. So we want to avoid doing that with any of the products that we've got available right now. When I say, all these products, it's about 5. There are 5 herbicides that are really effective on hydrilla. So we try to rotate through because we don't want to build that tolerance up again. The other areas kind of scattered around the edges, the littoral zone, this area south of Makinson Island, are areas where we've got a lot of grass. And when I say grass, it's different from what you say, or you mean when you say grass. When I say grass, I'm talking about Kissimmee grass, maiden cane, bulrush, things that are up above the water. So areas where we've got a lot of those grasses and the SAV underneath them, we found that we can take the hydrilla out and we will get eelgrass coming back like gangbusters. So we've got an area where we've got that mix. Those are areas where we can concentrate on turning the population from mostly hydrilla to mostly native vegetation. Now, if we've got an area that's just solid hydrilla, never had anything else in there, like out in the open water, that's not an area we normally target because we're just out there killing hydrilla, killing hydrilla, killing hydrilla, and as soon as you turn your back, it's growing again, and it's that cycle that we have got to get out of because, again, it is not environmentally or economically feasible to keep managing that. All right, let's talk about these areas in orange. These are big areas out in the middle of the lake. And if you go back and pull up in this document and look through here, the first page here, which was page 13, objective D1, manage SAV hydrilla on Lake Toho to be 30 to 40% total coverage. And that number is kind of a magic number that people always think about. Oh, the lake's perfect if you got 30 to 40% vegetation in it. There's not a real scientific basis for that number, but everybody agreed when we went through the multi-year process to generate this, was that on Toho and Cypress, that seems to be an appropriate coverage for submerged vegetation out there. It's about 40%. So right now, we are at, let's say 80%, just because if you want to compare 80 to 40, that's pretty easy math. So if we want to try to meet this objective and get hydrilla in Lake Toho down to 40%, we've got to come out and manage hydrilla in these big orange areas. And that is a lot trickier. In the south end of the lake especially, the south end of the lake it's a lot more like Lake Kissimmee in that when you get a heavy wind, a big storm that blows through, that bottom is a lot more consolidated and it will churn up really quickly. and just become like chocolate milk, which is something we don't want to have out there. We don't necessarily want it to be full of hydrilla, but taking all the hydrilla out and just having nothing else there is probably not the best option at this point. So one of the things we're looking at in the south end is kind of metered hydrilla management, followed by eelgrass planting or expansion of the peppergrass and the eelgrass that's already down there. So that's something that is in the back of our minds. And this, managing these big orange areas, these are 5-year projects. This is nothing we would do all at once. This is something that's got to be done in stages and monitored to see if it's working. We don't want to do anything that's not really having a positive impact. Number one, not really good science, and number two, we're throwing a bunch of money out there, and that's not good budgeting. So those are the things that are second tier, where we've got to get everybody to agree that yes, it's important to meet this objective D1 in the management plan, and this is the way to meet that objective. We're nowhere near that yet, but these areas in green, these are the ones that are up for discussion. Everything in green, if we manage this once a year, it's about $2 million. Some of these areas are going to be needed to manage twice a year, Goblet's Cove in the north end, because we're trying to keep hydrilla at the lowest feasible level on those two spots. That ups the price to about $3.5 million. So we are getting really close to spending everything the legislature allocated. But again, all this is preliminary. These are things that our interagency team has said are the best possibilities for discussion. We're not saying this is what's happening next week. We're not saying we've already got the product ordered and the people lined up. This is what we are opening up for the initial discussion. So at that point, I'm going to start taking questions and see where the discussion goes. Stay here as long as it takes to answer all the questions. And if somebody wants to pass around just a blank sheet of paper, I want to get all of your names and email addresses, and I'm going to add you on to the distribution list for every time we send out an announcement, a meeting, anything. If you want to write 2 things down right now, 3 things down right now, my name, Ed Harris. My phone number, my mobile number, which is the best way to get me, is 321-246-0573. 321-246-0573. That's the best way to get in touch with me. You can text to that number, leave a voicemail if I don't pick up the phone, but I will always get back in touch with everybody. The third thing, which we just finalized today, is we're going to have a large public meeting on Wednesday, September 18th. And it's going to be at the Extension Office in Kissimmee, out there at Silver Spurs. So September 18th, 6 p.m. We're going to send a public announcement out through the listserv that we use, and I'll make sure to add all of your names and email addresses onto that before we send that announcement out. And we will probably send that announcement out several times so that everybody can get it on their calendar. It's going to be very similar to this. We're going to show these same maps. We may fine-tune them a little bit. We're going to answer questions. We had a public meeting in February. 95% of the questions were, why the heck aren't you managing hydrilla on Lake Toho? And the answer at that time was, we don't have any money. If somebody can get us some money, then we'll have a better option to do stuff. And one of the county commissioners got a lot of people together, and they got us some money. And now we're in the position of actually being able to entertain some ideas to have some shifts out there. All right, so at this point, I will answer questions. And if I don't know something, which is entirely likely, I will make sure that I get an answer back to you, because I don't want anybody to go away from this in a couple of weeks and say, he came and talked to us and didn't tell us anything. All right, so who's first? Yes.
What about Cypress and Kissimmee?
Lake Cypress, the plan is to manage as much hydrilla in Lake Cypress as we can for the next 4 years. And what we expect, the last treatment we did out there was probably, I think it's like 3,200 acres of hydrilla out of a 4,000 acre lake. Next year, we expect it to be more like 1,800. The year after that, we expect it's going to be more like 900 or 1,000. So it's going to get smaller every year. And we understand that we're going to get growth out there. And the regrowth of hydrilla that we see in all these systems is not from plants that we didn't kill. It's from the tubers that are down in the sediments that start growing back immediately after the herbicide has dissipated out of the water and broken down. So there are millions and millions of tubers, like seeds, that are out there in the sediments just waiting to come on. And a tuber can be viable for up to 10 or 12 years. So the idea is we're going to encourage expansion and replanting of the native vegetation in Lake Cypress while we continue to manage the hydrilla down. So it's going to be a two-pronged approach. For Lake Kissimmee, you know, since the late 1990s, Lake Kissimmee has not had a lot of hydrilla in it. That the Northeast Cove, there was an agreement for the Northeast Cove a number of years ago. There was a very influential waterfowl hunter who knew a state senator, and the agencies promised, we're going to leave this area alone. It's going to be full of hydrilla. Whatever grows in there for the waterfowlers, that's just the way it's going to be. So we really don't do anything in there except for some water hyacinth control. That's probably the biggest area of hydrilla on Lake Kissimmee. I did not print out the portion of the management plan that talks about Lake Kissimmee. Because Lake Kissimmee didn't historically have that submerged vegetation, you know, the ideal coverage on Toho and Cypress is 30 to 40%. The ideal coverage on Kissimmee and Hatchnaha is 15 to 18%, because that is more in line of historic coverages out there. So in terms of hydrilla on Kissimmee, we are managing hydrilla more often on Lake Kissimmee where we see it, where we can get those other plants to come back in. Because we don't want Lake Kissimmee to turn into Lake Toho because, well, let's just leave it alone for a couple of years and see what happens and we'll deal with it then. The idea behind invasive plant management is to manage these issues before they become an emergency. By the time they become an emergency, that horse has left the barn. You know, we can get down to, on Lake Cypress, we're spending $500,000 a year or less to keep it pretty well managed. But if we let it go again, then we're back up to $2.5 million every 4 or 5 years, again, which is not economically or environmentally desirable.
You get to where we're at with Toho right now.
Right. We do not want other lakes to get to the condition that Lake Toho is in. The agency, I mean, because this is such a controversial issue, the agency created a hydrilla management position statement several years ago. And the nuts and bolts of it are the agency recognizes that hydrilla can be very detrimental to a water body, but it can provide, at some level, a benefit to anglers and waterfowlers. And we're going to try to find that balance. And that balance is going to be different for every lake because every lake is different. Every lake has its own personality. Every lake has its own, specific criteria that make it that lake. And we're also going to take lots of input from the public, and we use the general term stakeholder. Everybody is a stakeholder. You've all got a stake in these lakes. So we will craft a management plan for each individual lake based on those characteristics, and it can vary from year to year. You know, if we can come up with a plan for Lake Toho, we are going to go out there and just do a ton of work. But next year, we won't need to, just like Lake Cypress. So we're not going to say Lake Cypress every year. We're going to treat 3,200 acres of hydrilla every year because that's what we agreed to do. No, we're going to do it all as the situation warrants. Other questions? I can't believe there's no more questions. Here.
2 questions. So, is there any conversation around addressing the root cause, which is fertilizer getting into the lakes?
Yes. These lakes have been impaired by high levels of nutrients since the late 80s, early 90s. It would take billions of dollars to clean up what's out there, but millions of dollars to stop the problem from getting any worse, and maybe over 20 or 50 years starting to get it better. But yeah, we are looking at partnerships with Osceola County and the city of Kissimmee to create some stormwater treatment marshes where we can divert water coming in from all these sources to clean it up a little bit before it goes out to the lake. So we're thinking about it. I mean, the best thing we could do for Lake Toho is to move everybody a mile away from the lake and let that lake flood like it historically did. That's what needs to happen to clean that lake. But that is not going to happen.
I was going to say, I'm 100% for it.
I mean, if you look at, before the water control structures were put in, you get high water levels on Toho, low water levels on Toho, and now the regulated schedule has that change at about this much. We can get down to lower levels fairly easily, or at least a little easier, but getting a flood, the high water out there, we can never do it on Toho because of all the development. Now, the Water Management District actually bought flood rights around Cypress, Hatchnahaw, and Kissimmee so that they can get the water level up, I think it's 18 inches above what is now normally the regulated high pool. It's mostly going to go into cattle pasture and marsh. So on those lakes, we've got an ability to get those higher water levels, but again, not nearly as it should be. And I mean, how many people remember the Lake Toho drawdown, 94, the big scraping project? We'd like to do something like that again, but it's a lot more complicated this go around because of water levels for snail kite protection and water flows for Kissimmee River restoration. It'd be almost impossible to get all the water out of Toho to do that scale of a drawdown again. But we're trying smaller things. We were able to do an abbreviated version on East Lake and saw some really good results from that. Some areas, if we can't come in and scrape out these big areas of like dense cattails, we can burn them off. And we're doing big projects like that on Lake Okeechobee. We're doing torpedo grass and cattails where they're just taking over the marshes. We can come in when the water's low, we can burn those off, which historically happens, but not in a long time.
Once water drains out of Toho, how do you manage lake levels in Cypress and Hatchnahaw?
You have to open up the structure at Highway 60. You've got to get Kissimmee, Hatchnahaw, and Cypress low enough to take all the water that would come out of Toho. So you got to get those down first. But the Kissimmee River restoration, which is a federally mandated project, says we have to have a minimum, I think it's 1,000 cubic feet per second flow into the Kissimmee River.
Yeah.
So if you get those lakes down low enough to take all the water from Toho, you've got a period of several months of no flow coming out of Highway 60. So that makes it more complicated. You have another question?
Yeah, I had a few. You kind of touched on a little bit. I was going to ask, is there going to be another drawdown? I thought the last one was in 04 or 03.
We're talking about it. We really want to do it. We've got to find the money. We've got to be able to get the permits from the Corps of Engineers, and we've just got to have the right conditions to do it. But we have been thinking about it for the last 20 years.
I was going to say, it seems like the use of aquatic herbicides and mechanical harvesting has become almost useless and a waste of money. I think it was 4 years ago now, they had 4 very large harvesters on the south end of Toho, and they cut a lot of grass out there, and I want to say it was in 6 months, it was right back again. And I mean, that had to be a several $1 million loss.
It was, and that was a research project that we partnered with the University of Florida, and that research was demanded by a group of anglers who were convinced that harvesting hydrilla was a much better way to do it, and it was mandated by the governor, and it was researched by the University of Florida. And we spent a lot of money to basically go out there and mow the grass. In fact, we got more complaints from anglers who couldn't use topwater lures for weeks because of the fragmentation that was coming off of the plants. So there is a place for harvesters out there, but not hydrilla. We can use harvesters pretty well in dense vegetation where it's only that one kind of vegetation we're trying to harvest. But you can't harvest water hyacinths out of the middle of bulrushes and Kissimmee grass and pads without taking everything all at the same time. It is completely non-selective. It's like mowing your yard. You don't have a flower bed here that you can go around. It's all mixed in there together. So we're still looking at the ways we can use harvesters out there, but just not for hydrilla.
Yeah. The management that needs to occur within the littoral zones, like from Browns Point to Granada, Friars Cove, all the way to South Steer Beach. And it's not highlighted in here, but I fish it quite a bit. All of this area inside of Big Grassy, all the way down to Reds, most of this stuff down here. I mean, a lot of this stuff, we're talking about prime spawning habitat. And I know you've already mentioned you're not a fisheries biologist. That's fine. But obviously, that stuff is completely interwoven with either Illinois pondweed or hydrilla within the Kissimmee grass. It seems that the numbers of spawning fish have decreased drastically within the last 2 to 3 years. How soon would that occur, and what is the method to remove hydrilla from inside of Kissimmee grass?
Well, none of the herbicides that we use for hydrilla management have a long-term impact on the Kissimmee grass. Some of them, you'll see some temporary browning, but the Kissimmee grass will come back. Now, the areas where we've lost large areas of Kissimmee grass, mostly on Lake Kissimmee, and nobody believes me when I say this, but the research backs it up, are due to the non-native apple snails that have invaded in the last 20 years. That those snails eat the new grass as it is growing up from the bottom because they like that tender green vegetation. The Kissimmee grass is an annual plant. The grass grows great, and then in the wintertime it dies off, and it doesn't just green back up, it's growing back up from new shoots off the bottom. So the snails are eating those new shoots as they come up. Research in Louisiana showed that these snails are, in addition to eating grass, they are eating frogs' eggs, and they have seen a huge decline in the bullfrog population in a large area in Mississippi and Louisiana. But we do have a herbicide. It's called Procelicor, and it will manage hydrilla and just about nothing else. So that has been really effective for us, but we can't use it every year because we don't want to get back into that potential likelihood of having hydrilla out there that now the Procelicor is not effective on because we used it so much. We don't want to build up that tolerance. But for Big Grassy Island in particular, that is snail kite central on Lake Toho. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has generally said, hands off.
I understand.
That they want some hydrilla in there to produce snails to feed the snail kites. Now we've been able to take out floating tussocks, some of the big areas of this water primrose that chokes everything else out by using harvesters at a certain time of year or only during certain hours of the day, because that's also one of the biggest places where people will hunt ducks on Lake Toho. So, we do not go out there in the middle of duck season and just start chewing everything up. So we have to work around all these different calendars, and we definitely work with our fisheries biologists to pick out the areas that are going to be important for spawning, and those are going to be a priority over, well, yeah, it would be nice just to work in this area because.
Sure. The Illinois pondweed on Toho. I know you said that it's a native plant. It's bad, it's out of control out there. Is that a no-go, or will there be control for that grass as well?
There would be control for Illinois pondweed only to maintain public navigation, the boat ramp, the marked navigation channel, any place there was a safety issue for boating. But other than that, Illinois pondweed is not a plant that we're going to manage.
Joe's got a question, and I got one as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question is what are we going to do with the end results? Are they constantly putting these chemicals in the water. And what I'm getting at is, we know what Roundup has done for men and females. These chemicals are going to possibly do the same identical thing for people that's eating the fish. I mean, we're spreading it, we get it, they're eating it, like you say, when this comes up, and you got these little bluegills are eating everything, shell crackers are eating up the bottom, everything. What are we gonna do about that for us men? And prostate cancer, and women with cancer. Cancer is the biggest thing now that's going on, and it's the biggest lawsuit it is out there with that Roundup.
Well, first I can say Roundup, the active ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate. We do not use glyphosate on the Kissimmee chain except for maybe like 0.1% of the work that we do out there, if that's the only herbicide that we can use. We tell our contractors, and the contracts we also have with private companies and cities, counties, water management districts, that glyphosate and copper are like the absolute emergency herbicide that has to be used, and we have got to look into it, and the FWC biologist would have to authorize that specifically, and we just don't do that. If you look at all think about an aquatic herbicide is a pesticide. If you look at the thousands of pesticides that are registered for use, there are about 20 that are registered for use in water. They all have the highest safety classification. None of the herbicides that we use out there have been shown to have any tie to any type of cancer. That's something that everybody is very concerned about, and that's one of the reasons we said we don't know about the glyphosate issue. One group says this, one group says that. So you know what? Let's just stop using it until we get a definitive answer. So we are definitely not using anything out there that has a whiff of a possibility of a carcinogen.
Was it glyphosate, or was it the surfactant that's in specifically Roundup that was causing the cancer? I thought it was the surfactant. It was
a surfactant. Everybody points to the court case. The court case was a jury that said, oh my God, give these people billions of dollars. It was not scientists saying this data is incomplete, we really need more data. So that's kind of the Roundup story. But you're right, Roundup is illegal to use in water because that surfactant is what's toxic to fish. But there are aquatic versions, rodeo is probably the best known one. Rodeo is allowed to be used in water because it does not have that surfactant. But we don't even do that. Most of the herbicides we're putting out there, the most concentrated one that we use goes into the water at a rate of 3 parts per million, which is, if you think about an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but that's like half a cup into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's that dilute. A lot of the other ones we put out there at parts per billion. When we were using sonar was going into the water at 4 parts per billion. So very, very diluted out there. We just don't use anything that has any kind of whiff of being a carcinogen.
There's still 17 approved herbicides?
Well,
I know you use typically 5 or 6, the same one.
About. Now, when I say approved aquatic herbicides, those are things that we might use on water hyacinths, water lettuce. We have a new plant on Lake Toho that is causing a problem. It's a little floating fern. It's a non-native mosquito fern that is really choking things out, and we use some of those herbicides on that. 17 is a rough number. Somewhere between 10 and 20. I have to sit down and make a list, but very, very few. And especially when we talk about hydrilla management and even floating plant management to some extent, if you think about a field full of corn or wheat, you're trying to control 30 weeds and save that one plant. We are doing the exact opposite. We are controlling one weed and trying to save 30 or 50 other native species out there. So we are extremely cautious in how we do that. All the contractors that do work for us, all of our biologists have gone through training to be, licensed by the state and the federal government to do these applications. And we have to go through regular updates every year to maintain that training. So it's not just a bunch of knuckleheads out there throwing stuff in the water, because they're not getting paid by the gallon, they're not getting paid by the acre, they're getting paid by the hour. And they get paid the same whether they are driving around surveying or whether they are making an application. All of our contractors have GPS trackers in their boats. So we can see when the boat is moving, and when they turn the spray gun on, that track changes color, and we can go in and measure. Okay, they made an application that covered 500 yards of shoreline. They submit reports to us every week. Here's who was out there, here's the number of the boat they were in, here's how much product they used, here's how many acres they covered. And we can pull up, it's a program we call Spray Tracker. So we can pull that up in Spray Tracker. Okay, let me go find boat number 5. They claim they did this. And you can look at all that and say, yeah, that looks pretty reasonable. We think that's right. I know that area. They spent most of their time looking and not actually spraying. And if something seems off, we will go back and dig into it deeper. And there are some companies that have received fines, state and federal. On the low end, the penalty is we don't pay them. That didn't look right, it didn't work, or you're claiming something you didn't do, we're not going to pay you, and we're going to ask the Department of Agriculture to investigate. So there's a lot of oversight out
I
there.
was going to ask, because I remember the early stages of that program, they used to show like a pink line and be something different than where the boat was at.
Right.
If they were spraying, and that way they could tell if somebody was out there and it's too windy or what have you. Is South Florida Water Management, North Florida Water Management, like Army Corps, is that on any of the contractors now?
Well, the Corps of Engineers is their own separate thing that we have no control over. We have some input into what they do, but really the Corps of Engineers does whatever the Corps of Engineers wants to do. And that's mostly the St. Johns River, some portions of Okeechobee, and Lake Seminole up in the Panhandle. Everything else is done under contract with FWC. So our private contractors, our city, county, water management district applicator boats, all have GPS trackers.
I remember I asked you on the phone, because I get this question a lot, and I've gotten it more and more the last few years doing conservation stuff, but like the concern about hydrilla not coming back in Lake Kissimmee itself, like the SAV being down so low and everything flowing south, pretty much from Hatchnahaw, south, Istopoga. A lot of people asking questions on how come none of it's taking root or coming back. I mean, that's probably the question I get asked the most. And you see it out there with the south wind or with the locks open at 60 and 61. If it's ripping at 61, that water is moving. Like you can have your trolling motor on high and be right there at the mouth of Cypress and not be able to stay put. And you see all this hydrilla, and it's so invasive. You're supposed to clean your trolling motor or your boat trailer. I guess that I'm just. Is there any thought process as to why none of it's coming back or taking root anywhere in Kissimmee, like before, even as it goes on south, especially with the mandate being at 60 there, where it's got to be open at least 1,000, which with 5 blocks, that's not that much, but
Yeah.
at 61, that's getting it. But even just a south wind or whatever, there'll be a lot of current coming through the mouth of Kissimmee and also into Hatch, but it seems like not much has come back, if any, other than the North Cove, like you mentioned.
Right. Hatchnahaw, a lot of it is, kept down because the water is so dark. And again, all of these lakes are very, very different from each other. Like Hatchnahaw is really the only one out there that has that very, stained tannic water. And that really prevents a lot of that growth. We see that on the Claremont chain of lakes. Those waters, also very, very stained. And you get some hydrilla in there, but not a lot. Hydrilla will move through, and up on the edges, it'll catch and start to take root. But a lot of that is being pushed through the Kissimmee River. And the Water Management District is very concerned about hydrilla in the canal as well as the restored river, and they do a fair amount of management down there on their own. But yeah, a lot of the regrowth just is not happening. We don't think we have the tuber base in Lake Kissimmee, and we think whatever tubers were in Hatchnahaw are trying to grow, but they just can't get enough light because of water sustained.
So are there any areas, like the north end of Toho you were talking about earlier, where it's just, so bad that you need to go in with a broad spectrum and they just wipe out everything and start fresh?
No.
No?
No, there is, lake management, unless you were talking about draining the water and going in with heavy equipment and getting down to ground zero, that's really the only time that kind of a process is effective. But trying to do it on the scale of what you're describing is very expensive and not very useful. And you probably would end up doing a lot more harm in the long term than good. It would look great for a little while, but if you go in and start messing around with things, the first plant that's going to come back is the most aggressive and invasive plant out there. So we don't want to see the expansion of torpedo grass and hydrilla and some of the other really invasive grasses that show up. West Indian marsh grass, we've got it's a little rush. It doesn't really have a great common name. Some people call it one of the nut rushes. We see that a lot in the airboat trails because the seeds are spread by the airboaters as they go through there, and it's starting to expand out and choke the marshes. Was it Rough Island, kind of there on the northwest side of Lake Cypress, has got hundreds and hundreds of acres of the West Indian marsh grass and this nut rush. It has just choked out all the native grasses. The flags, fire flag, bulrushes are just getting choked out by these plants. And we're actually looking to partner with Ducks Unlimited to go in there and restore hydrology in some of the farthest reaches of the marsh and get out these invasive grasses and get native grasses back in there. Any other questions? Yes.
Go back to Toho. So for Toho, minimum March of next year before any kind of decision or action, and then definitely the stuff in the littoral zone that's highlighted in green.
Well, the big areas, Goblet's Cove and the north end, that is probably going to happen in the fall, October, November. The other shoreline areas, the littoral zone, that's likely to be February, March. And we work with, as much as possible, our fisheries biologist related to spawning and our waterfowl biologist related to hunting. And what we had done in the past, say that area that's down there south of Browns Point, one year we treated in the fall because that's going to benefit the spawn. The next year we treated in March because that's going to benefit the waterfowlers. Once, February 1st, when the season's over, that gives us another window to treat. So we would kind of hopscotch around. And we still take those things into consideration whenever possible. But our biggest consideration is this document that so many people worked on for years to come to an agreement. Here's the framework of how we're going to manage the resources out there. And this is how we're going to manage for bass and crappie and alligator and endangered species and wading birds and public fishing, from the banks. All those things are in this big document. So that is what guides us. And we can't deviate specifically from what's in here. So let's try to find something that hits 2 of 10 of these things, but doesn't go contrary to anything that we're trying to do out there. So that's where it gets to be really complicated. Because what we don't want the public to say is, you spent all this time and money, we all came together to do this document, this plan, and here you've gone and done something completely different. Why the heck did you do that? That is what we are not going to do. Anything else? All right, well, you've got my name and phone number, and when you get the first email that comes out with the notification for the September 18th meeting, it will have my email address in it. What I encourage people, thank you
very much, sir.
What I encourage people to do is, if you've got a question about anything related to plant management, or your neighbor has got a question, give them my name and phone number. I hear all the time, well, I was talking to this guy at the ramp and his brother's barber said that, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. No, that ain't right. call us directly. We've got an office in Bartow, and the biologists there work on the Winter Haven chain of lakes, Istapoga, areas going over towards Tampa and up a little bit to the north. So those are the people to ask questions about. If there are questions about fish and fishing, we've got fisheries biologists in Lakeland, Kissimmee, Okeechobee. We will get you with the right person to get those answers. I would much rather take 1,000 phone calls and answer all these questions directly and specifically than have there be some misunderstanding. And I may tell you something that you don't want to hear. Like, you don't want to hear that we're not going to manage peppergrass. But I'm not going to tell you something that is incorrect. And if I don't know something, I'm going to tell you, I don't know, but I'll find out. But yeah, we want to make sure that you get the most complete information and come directly to the horse's mouth. Now, I've been called the horse's other end in some meetings, but we are here to answer, whatever questions you have.
Yeah, he's been, by the way, he's not kidding. He's always got back to me. He was one of the first contacts I had, and as far as doing conservation stuff, and explained to me about the locks and the numbers, and was I don't even know if you remember that, but it's been a few years back. But
yeah, we
you were
talked about
extremely
locks.
helpful. Yeah. And if he doesn't answer, he's never not called back. So thank you very, very much. Appreciate
Absolutely.
you
Thanks
coming out.
again for having me out. Hopefully we will see some of you at our September meeting. But again, anytime you've got a question, feel free to email or call. And I'm going to leave these other maps and stuff here so you can give that to anybody who wants one. And when we have a definitive plan as to what is going to be managed and when, it is going to go out in a public press release. So everybody will know up front. We are not out there in the business of keeping secrets. We don't have black helicopters. They come in the middle of the night. That's not the way we do business. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.